Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at STS_news. I would love to hear from you. Last episode with archaeologist Kate Freeman on her book, The Archaeology of Innovation, which covers examples from the entire span of human history. I talked about how a profound recentism marks technology studies. So much chatter, including by scholars who should know better, focuses on recent, especially digital technologies. In some academic circles, there is literally more attention paid to so-called emerging technologies, which are just promissory notes, than there is to technologies that actually fucking exist in the world and are creating actual agonies right now today. It's a tendency to focus on what my friend, historian David Brock, calls wishful worries. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure that you do, because it's obvious and it's madness. And Kate Freeman's book is a wonderful antidote to this problem. Today, I want to talk about a related issue, which is how much technology studies has prioritized the United States, Europe, and sometimes selected rich nations like Japan. I don't think this will surprise any of you, but focusing on the USA, Europe, and a couple rich nations is a shitty way to think about technology in the rest of the world. Now, there have always been exceptions to this Western rich tilt of technology studies, but not nearly enough of them. I truly believe the expansion of work done on Latin America, Africa, and Asia is one of the most important developments in science and technology studies today. And I'm proud to say that some of my colleagues, friends, and students are leading the charge. I think we need to do everything in our power to elevate those voices. And we also need to do something even trickier, which is to amplify and support scholars who are working inside the places we need to learn from. I hope to do much more of that on this podcast. You should hold me to it. It's in the general spirit of what I've said so far that I was so excited for a recent book to come out. It's called Electrifying Mexico: Technology and the Transformation of a Modern City. And it's by Diana Montaño, an assistant professor of history at Washington University in St. Louis. Electrifying Mexico tells the rich story of how Mexico City adopted electricity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Diana is a genius at finding examples and stories that will knock your socks off. And she does that work in the service of challenging the presumption that in adopting technologies, poorer countries are also adopting the values of richer nations. They are their own places and peoples. I think you're going to like Diana a lot. I had a blast with her. You'll see. Get excited. Diana, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Good afternoon, Lee. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the book and my future projects with you today.
Electrifying Mexico is a wonderful book. I'm not using hyperbole here. It's one of the books I've been looking forward to most this year, and it didn't disappoint me at all. So when you talk to strangers about the book, if that's something we even do anymore during like these weird COVID times, what do you tell them it's about and what you were trying to do with it?
Well, it's funny because every time since I began, putting together the project, every time I would tell someone, they will at first have like a dead look in them, like what? And then once I begin, talking, they will feel really at home in telling me about their own experiences with the technology. And it has been received very well whenever I talked about it. So I pretty much say, I'm looking at the making of electrifying spaces. And I'm looking at how people actually led that transformation, how they actually were the agents. They were the ones deciding to what extent they would electrify certain spaces, and then how they went about navigating those spaces, how they identify, how they interpret electricity, how it changed their lives, and how they saw themselves and their nation as modern through electricity.
You open the book with a lovely vignette from an 1883 novel, whose English title would be something like The Provincials. And in the story, a kind of fine lady worries about that she's going to go blind upon seeing electric streetlights in Mexico City for the first time. And she declares them a kind of barbarity. She's saying, like, luckily we don't have these where I'm from. It's such a kind of juicy opener. And I was just like wondering did you come across it, and do you think it was indicative of how other folks saw electricity at that time?
Yes, I actually didn't find it until like maybe I was halfway done through that chapter, and this is a chapter that actually was initially 2 chapters. So the first chapter was 1 and 2, and then eventually it was a monster. So I had to break it down. And my former advisor from the dissertation, he kept saying, you need to cut this down. And anyway, so I took his advice and I began to separate those 2. So it was in that division that I came across, the novel, and I used a number of novels for the first chapter. So Los Fuereños, it's a well-known novel for 19th century Mexico, and in particular José Tomás de Cuellar was critical of the transformations of the city. So I wanted those types of assessments that not only applauded or celebrated, right, the transformations, but we're a little bit more critical. And what it's really interesting is that I found this vignette, I found this scene after I had gone through putting together this conversation on how doctors were looking at the effects of electricity and were discussing whether or not there were health issues, right? That whether or not electrical lighting was a public health issue. So it was the other way around, and I'm like, yes. So it was really neat, right? Sometimes it's the other way around, in which you find some artistic coverage of a certain transformation, and then you want to find the real thing, whether or not it echoes reality. But in this case, I found reality first, and then I found the way in which it was transferred by this beautiful pen of Tomás de Cuellar.
Yeah, and so I mean, that just makes me wonder. Is this an author who, if you know Mexican literature, is known for kind of reflecting on technological modernity? And the reason I ask is because I was recently reading the Austrian novelist from the early 20th century, Robert Musil, who a friend turned me on to. And I just found like it's full of technological stuff, but no one had ever told me like, go read this novel because it's full of technology. So I just wonder, is this something the author is kind of known for by other folks, or is it just, they're writing about life and so there's technology in there?
I think so. I think that he's writing about life in general. He's not only writing about urban areas, but also, villages in the highlands. But he's tracking down. So he has a really good eye, right, to identify those minutes, those instances in which there's something that it's having an impression on people and they're reacting, right? So that's why I fell in love with his pen. And the same goes to, Federico Gamboa, who is the other well-known novelist for the Porfiriato, for the period that the first half of the book actually covers, from 1876 to 1911. So I actually paused, after putting aside the monster of the chapter as it was, and then I kept going back to to these novels. And it's such a fresh breath to read novels, when you're doing, particularly when you're doing
Oh man.
a really dry topic, right? Because and it is, we historians of technology, we know how dry our topics can be. So we actually have to fight, right? And we have to find those moments in which we can capture the attention of the reader. So I said, I've been looking at the development of electrical lighting. So a lot of technical dry literature, and I needed a break. And I was also looking at the different contracts between the different companies and the ayuntamiento, the municipal government in Mexico City. So I needed a break from all of that, and so I turned to the novels, and it is in looking at the novels that I began, looking for the reflections, how the reflection of electric lighting was captured. Right. So there's a lot on shadows. So I was like, I was captured by those. I'm like, okay, there's something here. And that's how, I went back to looking for literature on lightscapes and the culture of light and the study of light in general.
Yeah.
So
I thought you did like a really wonderful job throughout the book. I mean, I think you're really good at catching kind of perceptual stuff and where people are really tapping into how it looks. I remember one demonstration, I can't remember what chapter this one was in, but it was like they were really screwing up this light thing they're trying to set up, and you said it like just looked melancholic and kind of sad, and it was just like just finding these really juicy moments where it's like people were describing how it looked, because I think we can get so far away from that when we're writing about like electrical systems and we're just talking about bureaucrats or whatever. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, it was and I mean, I hope I had encountered the study of the census earlier on, because I would have become, I think, a historian of the census. But so the sensorial reaction, there's a lot there, and I think looking back, you're never done with the book. That's the whole
definitely.
thing, right? So I would think about the sensorial in terms of electricity, not only in terms of light, but sound as well, and smell, right? So the accidents in particular, right? So yeah, definitely. I really, looking back, after, as I said, after spending a lot of time flipping to contracts, and discussion about the different regulations and all of that, it was really good for me to move away from that and get a sense of those moments in which there were other things that were being captured. The way people interpreted light, the way in which how it actually lit certain spaces, and how it left others in the darkness. A darkness that was different, which is fascinating way of looking at shadows. Who would have thought I would be looking at shadows, and that would be something fascinating for me.
So how'd you start down this road? How'd you pick the topic? How'd you come to write about this stuff?
About electricity in particular? It's a really boring backstory, because my advisor was the one that he mentioned like 3 or 4 topics, and this is prior to me entering history. So I don't have I have a master's in Latin American studies, and I was doing social policy for my thesis. So I did a thesis on social policy on hometown associations. Those are associations established by Mexican migrants in the United States, and then how they send money back to via remittances or other ways, to their hometowns to create jobs, right? So I was fascinated by that type of social policy and those type of programs, and I did research in LA with those hometown associations, and then I went down to Michoacan in southern Mexico, and then in the north, close to my hometown. So I was doing that type of really, grounded ethnography, almost research, and then I turned to history for my
Huh.
PhD, and we were talking about different topics because my advisor William Bisley, he had been my advisor for the masters, so he's the one that pulled me to history actually, and we're talking about a number of themes, subjects that had been unexplored, and he mentioned electricity, and I was like, oh no, forget about it, right? So I would brush aside a lot of things, like many advisors give you a lot of feedback, and you just brush a lot aside, and so for that, it sounded really boring, right? Because for me, it was the way I saw it was, well, he wants me to actually document the development of the national grid. And I was like, no, that's not going to happen, right? But then I turned to look at some of the historiography for the U.S. So one of the first books that I read was Linda Dark Light. And it was the main story, or the highlight of the book, has to do with the invention of the electric chair.
Okay.
Right, and the electric chair, and then the battle between Edison and Westinghouse, right? So all of that, and the displayed, the exhibitionary context of the second half of the 19th century, as well as the electric chair itself, capture my attention just because of the way in which people were responding to something that it was supposed to be this modern way of killing people, right? And it turned to be something that was horrific, right? At the beginning, because they didn't know how to measure, how to actually provide enough electricity to kill someone, and so the effects were horrific, and the press itself, they wanted to end it. So it was really interesting to see that, and how people debated this. So I went back then and say, well, maybe there are other ways, right, of looking at this topic, which are not as dry as I thought. And then I obviously went to read Electrifying America, which, my book copies, obviously, and
that's funny. I didn't even think about that. This is a famous book by David Nye.
Yes, I mean, and there has been. I think I went to a conference, maybe a couple months ago, and one of the first things that this scholar said, people have to be more creative with titles. There's like electrifying everything, right? And I was like, oh, my book is about to come out, and it has that title. I'm like, okay, I guess, right? Because there's a lot of like electrifying Europe, electrifying India, and all of that, and I'm like, yes, I guess, I just went with it. But yes, so that's, it was the way in which social historians had documented electricity and electrification in the U.S. that actually caught my attention, and that's how I said, well, yes, I'll go ahead and look into it.
Right on. And I mean, maybe you've already said this basically, but there wasn't much written about electricity and electrification of Mexico or in Latin America more broadly when you were getting started? Or was the literature pretty small?
Well, it was going back to the dryness. It was one that was asking different questions. That's the whole thing, right? It was asking questions about the industry. So they were dedicated to capital, the infrastructure, and the companies. There's a fixation with the companies, following the stories of the companies and what they did, how they negotiated, the power that they held, and then the whole thing about, nationalization, denationalization, privatization, all of that, like that was like the main, like the bulk, I would say, of the historiography was there. And it wasn't by historians. I mean, it was political scientists, other individuals that were interested in, the economic and political aspects of electricity. So there was very little. There was one, when I began, there was one dissertation on public lighting in Mexico City. And it was a dissertation that eventually became a book. While I finished my my book, obviously, and but it was really, it was just public lighting itself and not others. And so there were a number, obviously, of also government mandated or sponsor books,
Sure.
assessments of the industry, particularly after the revolution, when they want to quantify, right, and make an assessment of how far or what was needed in terms to develop the industry.
We have those kind of dry as dust histories here in the States too, of like the nuclear electric power industry and stuff like that. So we have our share.
Yeah, I mean, and they have a lot of data, which is great.
No, they're crucially important, but
yeah, it's not like, that I started at zero. Yeah. Like it's just my questions were different, but at the end of the day, I need to use that to assess as well the expansion.
Totally.
And speak the numbers as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're always very happy as a scholar when those things exist. It's just, it's not something you read for funsies. It's more like...
Yes.
So part of what you want to do in the book is complicate a kind of simple diffusionist view of technologies, where complex technologies are created in rich European, US like places, and then kind of diffuse out to poorer countries and get used there. So say a bit more about the role that kind of like theories and the way thinking about technology has informed your approach, and also what you found in the historical, to kind of illustrate this for listeners. Like when you're thinking about complicating that diffusionist picture, first of all, think about how you think about it theoretically, and then just kind of use some examples of stuff you found in the archive that kind of makes that picture more complicated.
Yes. So I mean, this diffusionist model, the one that, privileged the North Atlantic, the industrial North, not only does it privilege those areas of the world, but then it privileges innovation and dispersal, right? So then at the expense of that, we leave adaptation and use out. So in those histories, then technology becomes the all powerful, right? The unstoppable force. And it obviously, for us, doing histories of the global South in particular, it leaves no space for agency. So there's no agency conceded to local societies. They remained, as perpetual consumers of other people's technologies developed elsewhere. And obviously, it then also has to do with importing modernity, right? The modernity that it is, the parameters of modernity, the experiences, they're all, designed and, in a sense, conceptualized abroad, and then they're just imported. So in that sense, I like what Thomas Misa recommends, right? Of giving us the challenge of thinking of different groups and cultures and how they appropriate the same technology and then go on to use it for different ends. So then, far from dictating how a technology must be used, then we encounter technologies that are interacting deeply with society, right, and with the culture. So in that interactions, you have resistance, accommodation, acceptance, and even enthusiasm, right? So you have all of those, that complexity, right? The texture. So it is then for us to untangle those connections. And as I said, we want to look closely at individual technologies, but then really inquire carefully into the social and cultural processes that those technologies are undergoing when they arrive or they are imported right into those spaces. So it was in that sense that I wanted. So there's this emphasis in the book about grounded, right? Grounding electricity, and it's a pun. There are a number of those, and a lot of people told me you need to tone it down. I'm like, no. I'm gonna exploit them as much as I can. And it also, this is a book written in English, obviously, but it goes to show, to what extent our own language has been electrified, right? So in Spanish it's a little bit different, but so anyway, so in I was trying to get away from that, right? and does not mean that I'm going to cut off Mexico from the world, because it's impossible, right? We have the main companies in the 19th century. They are at the beginning they're British, and they eventually become German, and then Canadian and American companies, right? So those networks, those linkages are there. Right. And I do, I bring them into the picture to see how this electric scape is expanding, right? But they're not on the center of the story.
Yeah.
Like that's not my interest, to follow the capital and to follow the technology, the machinery itself. Like I want to, and that's what I wanted to do, look from the ground up, pretty much as as possible, right? There are limits, obviously, as to how much you can actually. It has to do with your documents.
You tried, though. I can attest to that.
Yeah.
You worked a lot harder at that than a lot of people have in the past. So congratulations.
Yeah. So then it allows you to document how these electrified environments were neither natural or inevitable, right? Something that, Goodday does for Britain, and then Christopher Jones does for, energy and energy transitions in the U.S., right? That you have to actually go back to that context and see all the possibilities. Right. So for me, for instance, in the case of the different, in the first chapter, I talk about this spectacular view of Mexico City that had 4 different lighting regimes at the same time. Right. It had oil in certain areas. It had gas. It has turpentine, and then electricity, and they were all commingling, right? And as one was expanding, the other ones would move outwards, and that way. And at one point, you have a new gas, Solarina, right? It's Solarina, and this is a Mexican company that it's introducing this, and they get a concession, and that from being a really small concession starts to grow, because the illuminate, the type of light it's giving, it's really good. So it's comparable to electricity in terms of its lumen. So in that sense, it complicates the fact that there were other ways that people were testing, and that electricity did not just arrive to dominate. Oh my God, I'm forgetting.
No. I mean, there's contingency, right?
To dominate. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So there's pushback. People are critical of it when it first arrives. And they're challenging. There are all of these concerns about the problems, right? There's concern of whether or not it would cause ITCs, right, for people that are actually working under the light, in particular. So it was in those moments that you began to understand that it was much more complicated. And in following the big networks, you lose all of that.
It's funny, in the U.S. case, when I'm talking to students, I like to talk about like trucks, but also like planes flying over with loudspeakers pointed down. This was like something people tried with ads for a while, like just flying really low over towns. Or there was also, and you might have bumped into this, I can't remember if this is in the book or not, is here in the States, they tried these giant light towers. So instead of having street lights throughout, you just have these enormous towers that are like 100 feet tall with huge lights on them. So, yeah.
Yes, so those towers were actually were part of the experimentation in Mexico City. There were at least 2 of them that were established, as far as I can tell. But I then didn't get to hear or to be able to document the response to them. I just know that they went away really fast.
There's this wonderful journal from it might be late 19th century to early, like mid 20th century. It might even still be around in some different form, but it's just called The American City. And it's like, it's a journal where people wrote about new technologies for managing cities, but also, there was lots of ads for stuff. And there, so you can kind of see all the stuff that people were
Mm-hmm.
like trying to sell cities to manage stuff like light, and you can find the trippiest stuff there from like in the teens and the 20s. You're like, whoa. So that was a thing for a second. So like I'll always love that, especially with undergrads. I think it's a lot of fun.
Yes, I mean, I mean, I have talked in the past about, as a historian, go to the archive and then you try to get as much as possible, particularly if you are going from, you have to fly thousands of miles to get to the archive. You really want to document as much as possible, and sometimes you miss things, right? So you end up, there's something you read and don't actually write down. So there was one case, for instance, in which people were complaining of the municipality, the ayuntamiento, spending so much money and dedicating so much money to alumbrado, to public lighting, and they said, well, one of the ways in which you could have people that are out there at night, they should be the ones paying for it.
Oh, so it'd be like a toll.
One of the ways, yes. So what they wanted to do is to have these boxes below each light, right? And then you would have to deposit a coin, and they will light up maybe 100 meters, and you had so much time to traverse that area, and then you could just light your way, through the night as you went back and forth, and then so it wasn't the individual. Then that they had.
Diana, I'm going to erase this in the eventual podcast because we don't want like neoliberal city managers and mayors getting a hold of this idea. They're like,
yes,
tolling light. That is the best idea. So we're going to go ahead and cut. No, I won't actually cut out this section. But so let's just kind of like get, on the table, like just the basics. So like how and when did electricity first come to Mexico, and kind of like what was the the primal scene of electricity in Mexico?
Yeah, so the first experiment was in the early 1880s, and it began with 40 lights that went up around the Paseo de la Reforma. And this was like the most prominent area of Mexico City, obviously, and it went up for a celebration, for a civic celebration, and they remained up for a while, and then that's when the discussion began in the ayuntamiento whether or not this was a technology, right, a lighting system that could benefit, from expanding into other areas of the city. So some of the discussion then begins at that time in the 1880s, and obviously the discussion, as I mentioned before, doctors, chiming in and actually putting this up at their national. The national medicine, the institution for national medicine. I'm blanking on the name right now, but so what they do is that they bring up this issue that there's too much light, and that was a problem, right? At the beginning, because you had the brush arc lights, which they were measuring thousands candlelight, right? All of the sudden, so it's a different problem. Right. It's a different problem, and they're trying to assess whether or not this is an issue, and whether or not this is an issue that doctors should be looking into. And it is, in different meetings, the same issues brought up around different phenomena, right? So the first one had to do with IDCs, and whether people that were transversing these areas were going just like Doña Candelaria, right? Whether or not they will have, their eyes will hurt after being exposed to that light. And so that was the first, and then that doesn't go away, obviously, because they were calling for additional studies to be undertaken in Mexico City in particular, to determine whether or not there was enough data to determine, this is not the type of lighting that we need because it's causing eye strains, and then thereby we need to, test out other types of lighting. And then eventually they come back, there's this explosion in the mosquito population. And they're tracking it down again to, it's the electric lights that are causing this, right? And it's really interesting, then studies are and doctors from a number of areas, backgrounds are coming to discuss this. And the last type of debate in the Academia de Medicina, it's one dealing with plants, right? And these Montezuma trees in which Mexico City is popular for, because these are centennial, trees. The ahuehuetes, there was concern that they were not. They were being hurt by the light itself, because they were awakened throughout the night. Right. So as long as there was no definite answer on the effect of electricity and electric lighting to not only the human eye, but also to animals and to plants, those types of anxieties remained. Right.
Yeah, and I want to make clear to listeners that there's a couple topics we're going to talk about together that they might sound goofy, but there were very similar worries in the United States and Europe about the health effects of light. So there's a couple of things where I don't want it to seem like, oh, this is just something goofy that was happening in Mexico, because it's totally happening in the U.S. Anxieties about glare and all this kind of crap. So,
so anxieties and fears were widespread, like all over, right? Wherever experimentation was happening. And obviously, in my case, I'm trying to document how Mexican intellectuals, Mexican professionals were responding to this. And also people like Doña Candelaria, that ended up in the novel, how regular people were responding, right? Sensing, in a sense, that changes on the streets.
Right. So can you tell me the president during this period that you look in the first half of the book, his name, can you say his name?
Porfirio Diaz.
And so, famously, Americans like me are not taught like Mexican history at all, or Canadian history, even though they're our neighbors. But this guy, he's president for over 30 years, like 31 years, maybe disconnected by 4 years, but like a long time.
Yes.
And he's a modernizer in a lot of ways. So what does kind of like, how does the technology of electricity and electrification connect to his kind of nationalist visions and modernizing visions that he's putting forward during this period?
Yeah, so Porfirio Diaz comes to power in 1876. He will take a break after 4 years and then come back and not leave until the revolution, right? So he implements this very violent, enforces this violent regime of peace and order, right? And this is a very positivist, I guess. Even the technocrats around him, they are dedicated to transform the society by the principles coming from scientific governance, and also the expansion and wide implementation of technologies, right? So they are wedded to this new way of governing the population. So they are backing major technologies and technological projects, let's say, around the country to unify the country first, right? And also to fortify and allow for this expert-based economy to take root, right? So this is what happens. So there are a number of transformations throughout the country. And among them, obviously, it's the it's a beautification of the cities, right? So there's, with this new model of the economy, with the export-based economy, you have increased income, obviously, for the government, and some of that is being funneled towards the cities, and obviously, being the jewel of the nation, Mexico City has to represent, right? So the most funds ended up in Mexico City. In terms of electricity in particular, every major event, every major milestone in terms of the electrification of the city, Porfirio Diaz was sure to right? So he was present. So he eventually develops a close relation with Edison, and I found some correspondence between them. And eventually, the only voice recording out there of Porfirio Diaz is a cylinder that he actually dedicates to Edison, right? Telling him, applauding what he had done, right? What he had done around the world through his inventions, but particular through electricity, right? And what he had done with electrical lighting and electrical implements in general. So, I mean, I do want to go back because there's a lot more there about exhibitions and these types of exhibitions of different technologies in Mexico City during the Porfiriato, which become part of these elite outings in which people would host. You know, it's the same time cinema is coming into place, right? So you have this very private and very elitist, obviously. Meetings in private spaces, and you have people, you know, actually connecting to people selling the machines themselves. So there's a different way, and there's this connection. So there's even, you know, in terms of the telegraph mail, and other types of services that were being, you know, described at the time as potential projects, potential schemes. So in all of that, Porfirio Diaz, I think it's infatuated with those types of displays, of technological displays.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, Edison's doing the same stuff. You know, some of the scenes you describe remind me of these famous, I can't remember, there's this one, I should have looked this up, but there's this famous Edison story where he invites investors up to his lab, and like he gives them a fancy dinner, and like they don't really know what's going to happen, and then he turns the lights on, you know, and it's like, woo! And it's like the same kind of like super elite, but there's also enough journalists in the mix so the word gets out of it into the public, and you know, there's this inside outside tension all the time, you know, like it's got to be insider but enough outsider so that people can at least be envious they're not in the room with us, and you know, so
yeah, there's actually, now that you're saying that, it reminds me, you know, when Porfirio Diaz went on his honeymoon, right? He married this socialite who was like 30 years younger than him, and they go to New York, and one of the places that he visits, it's Edison's lab, right? So I haven't found, you know, documentation about that visit in itself, but in the recording he actually mentions that, right? He mentions that, you know, that he saw it firsthand, right? So definitely that, and it's part of this exhibitionary culture of the second half of the 19th century, in which, you know, electricity finds, you know, at the same time it is part of, and it also amplifies at the same time.
So in the second part of the book, you really turn more to kind of, you know, bottom up, ground level kind of reactions to these systems, and to some degree, this comes out in your book as well, but I was double checking something about you today, and I was noting that you have not one but two articles examining the intersections between humor and class in electric streetcar accidents. So tell us what's so funny about streetcar accidents.
Oh, Lord. Well, I don't think there's nothing funny about it, but, you know, the way in which they become recurrent in a way, and people begin to make fun of them and document them, right? And also criticize the way the press is actually trying to discern who's guilty of the accidents. So I have one in which, you know, it's the first article that I published has to do with humor, and humor around the testing of different patents of the fenders in Mexico. So the fender problem, you know, it's a widespread problem around the world, where electric streetcars are being introduced, and in Mexico City that was obviously the case as well. There were a number of accidents that were construed differently. Obviously, it was construed as this inability of the lower classes in particular to either navigate electrified spaces, technified spaces, but at the same time, the individuals driving the electrical cars were also, criticized because they were unable to handle modern machinery, and that was a bigger problem, right? One thing is that people were run down because you don't know how to assess danger on the streets. That's on you. But the other one, echo and the concern was, if this is happening to the lower classes, the working classes, an inability to handle modern machinery, that's a bigger problem, right? So anyway, so with that, there were a number of patents that were filed in Mexico with different types of vendors. And then they were tested out in the public, on the streets, obviously. So there were public events, and in many cases, the inventors would actually put an ad on the newspapers calling for people to come in and testify, witness their marvelous, obviously, invention. So they would become really public events. In some of them, the president was there. Right. Yeah. Once again, looking from the balcony, right, from the presidential balcony, and in the test, they were testing with mannequins, and they eventually become more dramatic when the inventors themselves, they would substitute the mannequin because they were so confident of the invention themselves. So they were really dramatic, but in the coverage, in the press coverage of those inventions, they were being criticized, and even the way in which accidents were covered, there was a lot of humor. There were ways, and this is black humor, right? For those familiar with Mexico, humor negro, right? Really dark humor, and this was highlighted in discussions about the patents and whether or not they were working and what they were doing to the bodies of those that were being run down on the street.
And so you see it because it's like fits into the second part. You see this as a kind of the tension between these electricity systems and kind of the citizens, right? The people on the road. Is that what you want to draw out for readers?
Yes. I mean, it has to do with what they made of the problems, right? The problems that come with a new technology, and how the discussion itself drove the attention away from the machine itself and the companies, right? And towards the individuals, that this was a problem that, in order to decrease the number of accidents, and what needed to be done is to reform behavior, right? So individuals had to discipline themselves. They had to learn how to navigate the streets, how to stop in the corners, how to assess danger. So there's this whole idea, and in Mexico, obviously, this is colored with racialized language, right? So there are labs being established around the world, particularly the US and Europe, about to assess attention and attention span. So attention becomes a problem in the second half of the 19th century, right? Particularly as factories are expanding and accidents are, there's a way in which they want to quantify and they want to prevent accidents and blah, blah, blah. So attention then becomes a problem,
totally,
right? In the 19th century.
It's not a new problem with cell phones, right?
Yeah, exactly. So then at that point, those who lack attention and who are unable to respond to stimuli in the city are found to be either the underclasses, the lower classes, the pueblo, in the terms used at the time, or provincianos, people from outside of Mexico City, right? So there's this ridiculing of provincianos, of the rural folk. Yeah. So in the U.S. it happens something similar, right? With walking when the car is introduced, right? And
it's similar about jaywalkers, which jay is another word for hillbilly. So it's another way of. It was basically the hillbilly walkers, the people who don't know the rules of the road in the city. So,
Yes. So the assessment is really classed, but it's also, in the case of Mexico, it's racialized as well. And what's interesting, I find this not only through textual analysis but also visual
Mm-hmm.
analysis. So in the way in
Yeah,
which
you have wonderful cartoons.
victims, victims are being depicted. These are, I mean, the attire and then the facial characteristics are indigenous, lower class dress as well. So there's a double reaffirmation of who are part of the problem, right?
So sadly, it turns out we're both historians of attention and in the early. So like, we got to stop because we could talk about this for like 4 hours. Well, I mean, I think probably in my mind, you're kind of like best known for your chapter on electricity theft. Maybe that's because I saw you give a talk on the topic, but this is just kind of like how you are in my head. So, how'd you get it? And so you have this wonderful chapter on electricity theft and the problem in quotation marks of electricity theft. So how'd you get into this topic? How'd you find it?
So the place of Diablitos, these devices to steal electricity in Mexico City, are widely known, right? Images of electrical theft are really everywhere, right? So it happened to me. So I was early on in the research. I think I was doing pre-dissertation research, and I was writing the subway in Mexico City, and they have on and off, the company, the electrical company, would have campaigns against power theft.
Okay.
And I remember seeing posters, right, of like, don't steal power because, you're going to damage your electrical appliances. So say no to the Diablitos and things like that. And it was everywhere, right? This is, I mean, this also tells you how old we are, right? And how far back we actually began looking at this, because I remember some of the cards that you need to use public phones. Some of those cards actually had images from those campaigns, right? So they were part of the PR of those campaigns.
So
and so they're there, like, say no to the Diablitos, right? Or re-emphasizing the fact that to steal electricity is a crime, right? So that's the first, I already knew that in images of the outskirts of Mexico City, and, the tangles of wires all over, the place are really common. So I knew that I wanted to do something like that. But what I was actually, I came to power theft in the archives by serendipity, I would say. So I mentioned, and you were there for that talk, I mentioned that I had this initial idea to look at the archive for the main company that had supplied electricity to Mexico City throughout the 20th century, and that was the Mexican Light and Power. Eventually, it when it was nationalized, it became Luz y Fuerza del Centro, right? So when the first time I went there to the archive, they were beginning to, go through the documentation. They were still digitizing some photographs. I mean, it was really early on, and I was really excited because I was like the first person to go there, and they would tell me, you are a historian. So they really wanted to know something about me because they had never seen one, right? Anyway, so I was really excited too. But then in 2009, the federal government took over that company and actually shut down and put out of work the electrical workers associated with the Sindicato Mexicano de Electricistas. So then there my archive went, because it was closed down. They didn't know what was going to happen to it. It took years. It took about, I think, 6 years for that archive to eventually be transferred to the National Archives and to be accessible to scholars. So I found myself without an archive, right? I was there without an archive. So then I started looking at legal cases, because I was interested. I was interested on whether or not some of the individuals that had been injured by the tramways actually filed a suit, right? So that's where I ended up in the judicial archives, and to my surprise, because you could enter a keyword, right? And so I would enter the name of the company, and then the other company kept coming up. and we powered them. And I remember the first case was over 100 pages.
Wow.
And it had so much juicy detail. And I'm like, oh my God, I found a jewel, right? So then I kept going back. I remember I spent many, many days documenting all of those cases. And I only used some of them in that chapter and in that article because there were just too many. But and there were some interesting ones that I left out as well. But so they provide you a different way of assessing how electricity was being brought into different spaces, factories, into residential homes, small shops, the tortilla mills as well, the molinos, all of those places. And so I was really captured by that type of detail, narratives of the way in which individuals were actually consuming electricity, but in their own terms. So I spent a lot of time in going through those files.
I especially like, this is another topic where I feel like we need more work on this in the States, because I think it's more common than people than the literature so far recognizes, and utility theft in general. I told you when you gave that talk that I knew this guy in college who he was a former cable worker, but I won't tell people how I know this, but just for like smoking him up, he would connect people to cable, and this was how he was known. He would just get he got paid in weed basically by people around town, and would just he just went from place to place and hooked him up. And it's just I had flashbacks to that while reading your work, because it's the people trained to do the electricity work are very often the exact vectors for this illegality. And I just find that totally fascinating,
Yes, and it happens with this technology and any other technology in which there's the certain power that workers actually have over consumers, and there's always negotiation. And in that negotiation, and in surveilling and policing consumption, workers are not always 100% interested in safeguarding the company's interests, right?
Exactly. Well, and then also, listeners should. Phil Scranton, the historian of technology, has a book coming out on Hungary, and he has it might be a whole section of the book on what he calls the theft economy. And for Hungarian workers, it was very often more profitable to go do to not show up to work and go do maintenance and repair work, or probably steal utilities stuff on the side, than it was to actually go to work. So there was a tremendous amount of just skipping jobs and going work in the black market. So I think this is just a lot. There's a lot more to be said. And obviously our mutual colleague and my colleague here at Virginia Tech, Fabian Prieto Nanez, is working on this stuff too. So there's so much to be said about these topics.
Yes, definitely. Looking forward to it. We're talking, and I think Fabian was the one that, I met him just before I wrote that chapter, that article, and he helped me, beef up a little bit about the intersection of crime and illegality.
So cool.
And definitely there's a lot there too for us historians of technology.
So I think we're going to have to skip the third part of your book, which is sad, but it's good because we get to leave some for people so they buy your book and go check it out. I especially love the chapter on domesticity. Reminded me of the Mexican Ruth Schwartz Cowan or something like that. There's a lot of really great stuff there about different. I like the stuff about electrical appliances because it's feels very similar, but it's also different. The uses are different, like mixed drinks and stuff like that. But all right, we're going to skip that. And I want to say, you end the book with the nationalization of the electricity system in 1960. So what did nationalization mean? And, how does it kind of close out the story you wanted to tell? Why did you decide to land there?
Well, I decided to end it there. There were, I mean, I remember the first person that was from a press that was interested in the book. They said, "Well, you had to bring it to the present," and I'm like, "No, no, I will not go to the present," because I knew that I wanted, for each chapter to be written in such a textured way that it would not make justice for me to jump from 1960 to the present. That's 60 years, and a lot happened, right? So I did my best, in the last chapter to document, the ways in which politicians and workers actually deployed certain sentiments of nationalism, of masculinity, and all of that to defend the natural resources of the nation, right? In order to secure benefits, obviously, for them, and in the context of industrialization after the Second World War. So I knew that 1960 would be a good ending point, because then the drive to move this story into the countryside, right? There was even though the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, this national agency in charge of electrifying the countryside, but also expanding the national grid and first obviously building it and then expanding it, they had been working since the 1930s. So the 1960s then, it allows me to bring the story to an end in the way in which individuals were driving the story and were the ones behind it, right? Then in 1960, as I said in the conclusion, the narrative begins to change at that time, and it becomes very presidential, right? It follows the president around, and the president granting, right, granting the electricity, the infrastructure to the people, when up until that point, people had been, individuals on the ground had been the ones driving the electrification process, right? One of the arguments that I put together in that chapter is that the state is a latecomer, right, into the picture, and I wanted it that way, because they show up, even their efforts to regulate the industry, to regulate companies, to regulate rates. It's really, I mean, they began to do that in the late 1920s, right? When there has been already like 40 years of electrical companies. So 1960s, I mean, also I think I didn't have, as I said, another story in another space to cover, because the book moves chronologically, but also it moves from different spaces. And for me, to bring out the story again into the national platform and bring in national politics, and once again looking into the future, right? As the book begins in the 1880s, with the electrical exposition and this idea of how electricity would help industrialize, modernize the nation, that was, very much infused and united a number of people across different lines into this vision of the nation. So this happens once again in 1960, as the effort and the campaigns for rural electrification began to emerge.
That's beautiful. And so you got a lot going on. I know you have multiple kind of angles. So what should listeners kind of expect next from Diana? What's up next?
So I just finished my fellowship. My intensive, let's say, research at the Linda Hall Library for my second book project, which is the hydroelectric plant Necaxa. And Necaxa is the main hydroelectric plant south of Mexico City that it's going to provide electricity for the capital and 5 states around the capital throughout the 20th century. I'm interested then for that story and the generation part. So I'm going back, after spending the first book on the consumption side, I'm going back to the generation, and I'm interested in a number of, I'm going more into the envirotech, I would say. with the transformation of this really large watershed that was transformed in order to secure enough water for this hydroelectric plant. There's it's shorter stories, the span, it's from 1904 to 1914 as I visualize it today, right now. And it's a story that it's not only about the environment, the transformation of the watershed, but and then the workers themselves, which are primarily indigenous workers, up to 8,000 at a time, that were were displaced to work on the site. So it's a story about displacement and erasure. So displacement of not only these indigenous workers that went to build different dams, but also the technicians, the water technicians from abroad, particularly Americans, but also displacement of capital and machinery from the North Atlantic into Mexico. And then erasures for the type of erasures of the towns, the towns that were flooded, right? And it's a fascinating project. Obviously, I'm going to say that, but it's contemporaneous to the Panama Canal. It's built. A number of engineers were actually working at both sites. And what it's really interesting, and this is something that I learned during my stay at the library of the Linda Hall Library, in terms of innovations. I know this is not
innovations
the place to say
we can
it,
talk
but
about it.
No, but it's a time in which there were a number of engineering innovations in Necaxa, right? So the attention of the world was actually placed on Necaxa. There was coverage all over the world about what was going on in Necaxa, because there were a number of hydraulic and also civil engineer innovations. And what's interesting, that there are a number of innovations there that people are paying attention to. And in the case of Panama, the chief engineer there, in his assessment, writing in 1915 about Panama, says there are no major engineering innovations. Everything at Panama had been tested elsewhere before. So it's really interesting to see. But you tell someone about Necaxa and they don't know. They don't know about Necaxa, right? And at the time, the eyes of the world were actually placed there. So I just finished an article that it's going to go somewhere in the next month about that, about the making of Necaxa into this social technical imaginary by foreigners. So I call them technological pilgrims that are actually going down to Necaxa, are enduring the trek down to the site, which was a very tortuous trail to get there, and they're documented, they're writing about it. So you have writers, you have journalists, most of them obviously are foreigners at this time, and they are giving you this image of what's going on in Mexico, how as one of these journalists is saying, how water is waking up Mexico, right? It's waking up the nation. So that's where the big project
it sounds awesome, man. Deanna, thanks so much for hanging out for me today. It's wonderful to finally have a chance. We've interacted in a variety of ways for so long, but it was really wonderful to have a chance to talk to you today.
No, Lee, thank you very much for inviting me and for being such a great interlocutor for me. I was really nervous, I told you, and I just finished the book in the middle of the pandemic, and then I put it aside, and life continues and the semester starts, but it's time to go back and start talking about it again, because this is the exciting part, right?
Sharing.
So thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Ford is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.